Test. Okay, hello, welcome. Today we're going to be reading through chapter 1 of Fredric Jameson's Marxism and Form. Last time we read through the preface, but the quality on the stream was quite bad, and so I'm just going to start with a recap of the preface so that we're all on the same page, and then we'll go into reading chapter 1. I want to do something a bit more structured today than last time, which is basically to mark a clear distinction between when I am reading aloud, when I'm reading the text that we're seeing on the screen in front of us, and when I am doing what some would call close reading, which is sort of interpreting what is happening or what is being said in the text in front of us, and this will involve jumping back to previous sections and maybe bringing in other aspects or other examples, and potentially diagramming things as well. So I have two different ways of sort of showing that you'll see on your screen, and one will be reading aloud and one will be close reading, and hopefully that clear distinction allows you to better follow if you are following with the video, and also hopefully to be able to better find what you're looking for when you come back to this video, if you do come back to this video. So if you're not interested in hearing the text read aloud, you can just skip those sections and go straight to the interpretation or the explanation. And conversely, if you just want to hear the text read aloud, but you're not interested in the interpretation, then it should be easy enough to navigate visually to those sections as well. So to start with, let's do some close reading of what we reviewed last time in the preface, basically. So this is the preface for Marxism and Form. And we won't read through this because I've already read through it, but I just want to review some of the key ideas so that we're all on the same page. So one of the ideas that Jameson introduces in the premise, and sorry, let me just change this screen on the left to, yeah, let's leave it on the cover there so that we can know what we're talking about. So one of the key ideas that Jameson introduces in the premise is that what he wants to do in Marxism and Form is bring a, apologies, still working through some technical issues here. Okay. So one of the things he wants to do is bring an idea of French and German philosophy into an Anglo-American context. So he establishes this kind of idea of a triangle that is the triangle of dialectical thought in some sense. And this is between what we could call as like the top of the triangle, we have the English, the Anglo-American thought. And at the base of the triangle, we have German thought on the one hand, or German philosophy, and French philosophy. So Jameson's critique in the preface is largely about the way in which English thought has become wedded to a particular kind of empiricism. And this empiricism doesn't allow it to work speculatively, which is important for Jameson in both the German and French philosophical traditions. So in the German and French philosophical traditions, there is what Jameson calls a resolute abstractness. And this is particularly in the German tradition, at least in the preface, this is what Jameson was suggesting. So this resolute abstractness is in some sense in tension with the empiricism here, right? So we've got English, German, French. And in German philosophy, Jameson suggested that there is this resolute abstractness which allows German philosophy to have a dialectical character that Anglo-American or contemporary Anglo-American philosophy, Jameson says, doesn't have or is losing in some sense. So this is the idea of dialectics. And Jameson is interested in Marxism and form in reviewing the thought of these thinkers that we see on the left, who are German and French Marxists, in order to bring a sort of what he calls the rudiments of dialectical thinking back into the Anglo-American imaginary. So Jameson's project is to review these thinkers, but also, he says, he's not just working in the mode of a journalist, trying to give you a sort of interpretation that is already out there in the world of each of these thinkers. He instead wants to, in some sense, work through the difficulty in each of these thinkers' thought. And he makes an argument in the introduction or in favor of the difficulty of these thinkers in some sense. And in particular, he's interested in the difficulty of this thinker who's often associated with dialectics, Hegel, because he says that this difficulty is the price to pay for genuine thinking in some sense. So instead of walking through life or thinking, just accumulating ready-made ideas, this is the language that Jameson uses in the preface, instead of just accumulating ready-made ideas, Jameson says, to properly, to pay the price for genuine thinking, one must engage in this dialectical process of reckoning with difficult ideas and reckoning with this resolute abstractness. And in some sense, this is, I think, what Jameson wants to bring from German and French philosophy, or at least from these German and French Marxists, bring to bear on the poverty of the Anglo-American tradition. The one other thing that I'll note in this brief introduction is that Jameson is also particularly interested in literature. And this is for multiple reasons. One of the reasons is that this is the kind of mode and tradition in which Jameson is writing as a literary theorist. He wants to turn to these thinkers, in some sense, to think about literature, to work through the ideas in literature. Literature is his object for one reason or another. But he makes an argument for literature in the preface, not as an esoteric object, not as just an arbitrary choice of something that he's interested in, but as an object that is of particular interest to those who want to engage with dialectical thinking. And the reason for this, Jameson says, is because dialectical thinking engages with thought at the level of the sentence. Literature is, although it may be removed from empirical reality, or it seemed to be removed from empirical reality in some of its forms, it is in fact actually a sort of object that has a privileged perspective with respect to the dialectical understanding of reality, as always a sort of dancing between the tension between theory and practice, right? The world out there, the world as it happens, and the world as it appears to us in our ideas. So Jameson draws these a few different sort of dialectical pairs, dualities, in the introduction that we will, I imagine, return to often. One of these is the duality between concretion, between concrete reality and abstract reality, the concrete and the abstract. Another is between appearance and essence, how something seems to be and how something actually is. And not the last, but another very important one is between the object and the subject, right? Between what is objectively out there in the world and what we subjectively perceive as being out there in the world, or the way that we perceive that world. So these, in the dialectician's thought, these terms are always in tension, and you can't put too much weight on one without losing something important about the other. And this is also, we might say, why this kind of triangle of the English, German, and the French is important. It is not to say that English, German, and or French thought has any sort of privileged position within philosophy with respect to other countries. It's not a nationalism for any of these three poles. It is rather to say that each of the philosophical traditions in each of these countries can be seen to represent different ways of approaching philosophy, and therefore reality, and therefore, in Jameson's case, literature. And in Jameson's view, the Anglo-American way of approaching philosophy and literature, the English view, would do well to look at these kind of counterexamples of the German and the French. And this is the motivating thesis or motivating program for Jameson's book, Marxism Form. We also noted that this in the last session that this book was written in the 70s, right, in the 1970s, and so the context, both the academic context that Jameson is addressing and some of the examples and the senses with which he refers to some of these thinkers, are rooted in that time period in some sense, and should be read and understood as written for an audience in the 70s. That is not to say that there aren't things that Jameson says that nonetheless still resonate within our era. And indeed, one of the motivations behind this kind of reading that I would like to do is to bring out how much of Jameson's writing in this book still resonates with the contemporary area, and why we should sort of read it again. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to Marxism Form. I would also recommend you read the preface if you haven't already. But for now, we're going to go, as the stream is about, to chapter 1. And as I mentioned at the top, I'm going to switch between two different modes of streaming, basically, with a clear visual representation of when I am reading chapter 1, when I'm reading what Jameson has says, has said, and when I am doing what I was just doing before, which one could call close reading. So this stage, what you're seeing here will be when I'm reading aloud, and when we go to this screen here, it will be in close reading mode. So let me just set this up so that we're ready to go when we come back to it. And then to begin with, I'll start by reading aloud, and I'm going to read quite a few sections to get us started. So scrolling down here, past the preface, we're going to begin with chapter 1. Okay. To whom can one present... Sorry, let's begin with the title. T.W. Adorno, or Historical Tropes. So this chapter will be entirely about Adorno. To whom can one present a writer whose principal subject is the disappearance of the public? What serious justification can be made for an attempt to summarize, simplify, make more widely accessible a work which insists relentlessly on the need for modern art and thought to be difficult, to guard their truth and freshness by the austere demands they make on the powers of concentration of their participants, by their refusal of all habitual response, and their attempt to reawaken numb thinking and deadened perception to a raw, wholly unfamiliar real world. It is as though everything in the life work of T.W. Adorno were designed to arouse and exacerbate the very socio-economic phenomenon that it denounces, the division of labor, the fragmentation of intellectual energies into a host of seemingly unrelated specialized disciplines. So it is that Adorno's critique of modern culture, one of the most thoroughgoing and pessimistic that we possess, cannot be conveniently scanned in a passing hour between appointments. Indeed, for reasons which we will fully appreciate only later on, it is unavailable as a separate thesis of a general nature, for it is at one with Adorno's detailed working through of the technical specifics of his various preoccupations, those of the professional philosopher, the Hegelian critic of phenomenology and existentialism, of the composer and theoretician of music, musical advisor to Thomas Mann during the writing of Dr. Faustus, of the occasional but lifelong literary critic, and finally of the practicing sociologist, who ranged from a pioneering investigation of anti-Semitism in the monumental authoritarian personality to a dissection of the culture industry, the term is his, and of so-called popular music. But although these various and distinct fields of study have their own structures and laws, their own independent traditions, their own precise technical terminology, although they are to be thought of as something more and other than epiphenomena, the false consciousness that we associate with the word ideology, they nonetheless share an uneasy existence, an uncertain status, as objects afloat in the realm of culture. Adorno's treatment of these cultural phenomena, musical styles as well as philosophical systems, the hit parade along with the 19th century novel, makes it clear that they are to be understood in the context of what Marxism calls the superstructure. Such thinking thus recognizes an obligation to transcend the limits of specialized analysis at the same time that it respects the object's integrity as an independent entity. It presupposes a movement from the intrinsic to the extrinsic in its very structure, from the individual fact or work towards some larger socio-economic reality behind it. To put it another way, the very term superstructure carries its own opposite within itself as an implied comparison, and through its own construction sets the problem of the relationship to the socio-economic base or infrastructure as the precondition for its completeness as a thought. The sociology of culture is therefore first and foremost, I would like to suggest, a form. No matter what the philosophical postulates called upon to justify it, as practice and as conceptual operation, it always involves the jumping of a spark between two poles, the coming into contact of two unequal terms, of two apparently unrelated modes of being. Thus, in the realm of literary criticism, the sociological approach necessarily juxtaposes the individual work of art with some vaster form of social reality, which is seen in one way or another as its source or ontological ground, its gestalt field, and of which the work itself comes to be thought of as a reflection or a symptom, a characteristic manifestation or a simple byproduct, a coming to consciousness or an imaginary or symbolic resolution, to mention only a few of the ways in which this problematic central relationship has been conceived. Clearly then, a sociology of literature has its origins in the Romantic era, along with the invention of history itself, for it depends on some prior theorization about the unity of the cultural field. Whether the latter is thought of in terms of political regimes, the character of monarchic as opposed to despotic or republican society, historical periods, the classic, the medieval, the modern romantic, the organic language of national character, the English, French, or German temperament, or in the more recent language of cultural personality or socio-economic situation, the post-industrial, the industrializing, the underdeveloped. At first, of course, this type of thinking about the arts, the dawning historicity in the realm of taste, was the property of right and left alike, for it has its existential origins in the very convulsions of the revolutionary period itself, and royalists like Chateaubriand were as profoundly aware of the relativity of cultures and the historicity of human experience as was Madame de Staël, whose literature considered in its relation to social institutions, published in 1800, may stand, after Vico and Montesquieu, as the first full-blown treatise on the subject. Indeed, we shall have to concern ourselves later on in this book with the problem of distinguishing a sociological, quote, value-free approach to literature, which counts the Romantics amongst its ancestors, from the specifically Marxist form of literary analysis to be presented here. Once some such notion of cultural unity has been acquired, however, the two essential elements of the sociological operation, work and background, begin to interact in dialectical and indeed almost chemical fashion, and this fact of sheer interrelationship is prior to any of the conceptual categories such as causality, reflection, or analogy, subsequently evolved to explain it. Such categories may therefore be seen as the various logical permutations or combinations of the initial model, or as the alternating visual possibilities of the gestalt into which it is organized. The attempts of the mind after the fact to account for its ability to subsume two such disparate terms within the framework of a single thought. In this context, it becomes possible to place the vexed question of determinism by social being, or by, quote, race, moment, milieu, between parentheses, and such issues as those which seem to oppose Marxism and the Weberians turned out to be optical illusions. For from this point of view, the Marxist analysis of a phenomenon such as Puritanism, that it is one of the ideologies of early capitalism, or in other words, that it reflects and is determined by its social context, and that of Max Weber, for whom Puritanism is precisely one of the causes or contributing factors in the development of capitalism in the West, are essentially variations on the same model, and have far more in common with each other as ideograms, in which a form of consciousness is superposed against the pattern of a collective and institutional organization, than with what we may call the two-dimensional treatments of the separate elements involved, such as the works on the theology of the Reformers or on changes in the structure of 16th century commerce. Such thinking is therefore marked by the will to link together in a single figure two incommensurable realities, two independent codes or systems of signs, two heterogeneous and asymmetrical terms, spirit and matter, the data of individual experience and the vaster forms of institutional society, the language of existence and that of history. Let us follow the following passage from Adorno's Philosophy of the New Music. Let the following passage from Adorno's Philosophy of the New Music stand, therefore, not so much as an implied philosophical proposition or as a novel reinterpretation of the historical phenomena in question, but rather as a metaphorical composition, a kind of stylistic or rhetorical trope through which the new historical and dialectical consciousness, shattering the syntactic conventions of older analytical or static thought, comes to its truth in the language of events. Okay, so I'm going to stop reading aloud there for a moment, just to review some of this ground that we've covered in the beginning here. So Jameson is introducing Adorno, right, and the thought of Adorno. And to begin with, he says, Adorno is this figure that seems to be contradictory in a number of ways, right? It is as though everything in the life work of Adorno were designed to arouse and exacerbate the very socioeconomic phenomenon that it denounces, the division of labor, the fragmentation of intellectual energies into a host of seemingly unrelated specialized disciplines. So Adorno was this figure of multiple different kind of stripes throughout his life, and Jameson says he's particularly interested in Adorno's critique of modern culture, because Adorno's critique of modern culture, he's gone on to say, will allow us to see something about dialectical thought at work in the mode in which we talked about dialectical thought in our close reading of the introduction. So after this kind of review of of Adorno's different stripes, he says that all of these various, and Jameson says that all of these various and distinct fields of study in Adorno have their own technical terminology. And though we could go into each of them independently, Jameson wants to stay at a different level of analysis in terms of thinking about Adorno in some sort of way. And in being particularly interested in his critique of culture, the critique of culture here being a sort of name for many of Adorno's different projects brought under the same umbrella, Jameson seems to be claiming that there is something that these different projects of Adorno shares. Adorno's reading again here, let me just make sure I'm not highlighting. Adorno's treatment of these cultural phenomena, musical styles as well as philosophical systems, the hit parade along with the 19th century novel, makes it clear that they are understood in the context of what Marxism calls the superstructure. Okay, so Jameson introduces the idea of the superstructure, and down the bottom of this paragraph, he talks about the idea of base or infrastructure. So we thought about this a little bit in the preface, but it's worth just noting these terms down here, as I think they are quite grounding and important. So let's go with the terms Jameson uses here. So he says superstructure and infrastructure. And as noted in the preface, this infrastructure is sometimes referred to as base, but Jameson seems to be again here resisting this kind of this designation and instead contrasting the superstructure with the infrastructure. So the superstructure-infrastructure dyad is, in some sense, something similar to what we were looking at here, with the concrete and the abstract, parents and essence, the object and the subject, right? So the superstructure here is, in some sense, the right-hand side of these terms, and the infrastructure or the base is the left-hand side. So infrastructure is material reality, as a simple reductive way of putting it, and superstructure is the way that material reality is kind of cognized and turned into a particular form or structure. Okay, so going back to the left-hand side here on what Jameson says about this superstructure-infrastructure dyad. He says, such thinking thus recognizes an obligation to transcend the limits of specialized analysis at the same time that it represents the object's integrity as an independent entity. It presupposes a movement from the intrinsic to the extrinsic in its very structure, from the individual fact or work towards some larger socio-economic reality behind it. So what Jameson's saying about Adorno's method is in some way similar to what, if we recall, Jameson was saying about the idea of a street in his introduction. So when Jameson was talking about the way in which we needed to bring back dialectical thinking, he talked about this idea of a street and saying people want to go out there and do things in the street, right? This is a reference to political practice as it is described in language sometimes, as we say, people are out there on the street, right? These people are protesting on the street. They're doing things on the street. They're not sitting in their armchairs and philosophizing about the world. They're going out there into the world and doing things that change it, right? So the idea is that there is some action that is happening on the street, right? There is politics that's happening on the street. But Jameson says we can't isolate the kind of fact of those actions, the politics of what are happening on the street, from the way in which that street is located in a broader network of signifiers that gives the action on that street some meaning, right? So the question is, in what sense is the action on the street political? And Jameson wants to say, in order to answer this question, we can't just say that all action on all streets is political. Or we can say that, but it doesn't tell us much about which action we should be taking if we want to forge a sort of political sense or a meaningful politics. So Jameson says, in order to work out the sense in which the action on the street is political, we need to also think about where that street is within the broader network, right? So what is the perspective in which this action is taking place on this street? What is the time? Who is taking that action? All of these kinds of considerations are broader considerations that contextualize but also give meaning to the actual action that takes place on the street. And this, I want to suggest, is what's going on here in this kind of refusal to give in to either superstructure on the one hand or infrastructure on the other in dialectical thinking, right? That the material reality of facts on the ground, of the action on the street, cannot be divorced from the context in which those actions are taking place. There is a fantasy amongst some political actors, and particularly those of us on the left, that the undertaking of action, that what we need to do is just go out there and do something, right? Because we feel this kind of this oppressive force that is stemming and that is changing our lives in a way that we can't really control, and the only way it seems to go back and take control of our own lives again is to go out and do something about it. This is at least one sort of way of thinking about why people go out and do things in the street, right? And Jameson hasn't given a conclusive answer on this at any point in this text yet. I'm not suggesting that, but what I'm suggesting is that he is staying firm and fast to the dialectical reading of superstructure and infrastructure, of the concrete and the abstract, of facts and their signification in some sense. And another thing that's important to note, I think, is that this jump from infrastructure to superstructure, or this permeable lining or this boundary between the two, is caught up in some sort of way with what Jameson in the introduction referred to as language, right? When we say something like the superstructure gives meaning to the infrastructure, the context in which the signification of a street gives meaning to what happens on that street, that when we're talking about that signification, we're talking about a certain way of using language to understand what happened on that street, right? So Jameson has set up this dyad and this kind of problem of dialectics in some sort of sense, or this dynamic within dialectics. And here he is saying Adorno's critique of cultural phenomena is interested or engages with this kind of dialectical dyad. Let's just come back to these sentences here and see if they make a bit more sense now. So Adorno's reading of cultural phenomena here recognizes an obligation to transcend the limits of specialized analysis at the same time that it respects the object's integrity as an independent entity. It presupposes a movement from the intrinsic to the extrinsic, from the inside to the outside, in its very structure, from the individual fact or work towards some larger socio-economic reality behind it. To put it another way, the very term superstructure already carries its own opposite within itself as an implied comparison, and through its own construction sets the problem of the relationship to the socio-economic base or infrastructure as the precondition for its completeness as a thought. So the rationalizing or the understanding of the superstructure, of what is actually going on in the world, has to work its way through these kind of problematics of the dynamics between what's happening on the street and why that thing is happening on the street, or what that happening on the street means in relation to other streets, to other contexts around that same space, right? It's impossible to divorce these two things. And while Adorno respects the object's integrity as an independent entity, which is a certain respect for the sort of material fact of something, right? It's not to say my thinking can change what is actually going on out there in the world because, you know, this piece of music happened and this piece of music was played and I have one interpretation, you have another interpretation, you have another interpretation, right? This is not a dialectical method. This is a different sort of method that we could call a postmodernist method in some sort of way, where any interpretation goes and the objective reality of an object in the world, whether it be a cultural object or an actual physical object, is totally up for debate, basically. That's not what Jameson is saying here. Jameson is saying that dialectical analysis respects the object's integrity as an independent entity. But it presupposes a movement from the intrinsic to the extrinsic in its very structure, from the individual fact to the larger social economic reality behind it. So while it respects the sort of objective, factual reality of things, it doesn't think that those things exist in themselves divorced from the way that they are interpreted. Right? There is this movement from superstructure to infrastructure that is at work in dialectical thinking, and Adorno's analysis of the culture industry, Jameson is saying, is an example of that dialectical thinking. The sociology of culture is therefore first and foremost, Jameson would like to suggest, a form. No matter what the philosophical postulates called upon to justify it as practice and as a conceptual operation, it always involves the jumping of a spark between two poles, the coming into contact of two unequal terms, of two apparently unrelated modes of being. Thus, in the realm of literary criticism, the sociological approach necessarily juxtaposes the individual work of art with some vaster form of social reality. So, Jameson is using this word sociology here, and the comment or the point he seems to be making is that Adorno's analysis of the culture industry is what one could call sociological. Adorno is a sociological thinker because he doesn't see these works of art as totally separate or independent from the broader network in which they are produced. So there's a sociology of art going on in Adorno's thinking. And here on the next page, he says, the work of art takes place in a gestalt field, and the work itself comes to be thought of as a reflection or a symptom, a characteristic manifestation or a simple byproduct, a coming to consciousness or an imaginary or symbolic resolution, to mention only the few of the ways in which this problematic central relationship has been conceived. So, coming back to the street metaphor in some sense, the problem of dialectical thinking is how to contextualize this action on the street with respect to the other streets that exist out there, how to bring this kind of idea of language into being without dissolving the kind of action as it is in the postmodern approach, which is to say, the action itself doesn't actually matter, it's all about how we interpret it, but also without going too far the other way, which is to say only the action matters and there's no kind of interpretation that needs to be done, right? This is in some sense what Jameson is wary of in English empiricism, and the reason he wants to bring German and French thought back into the philosophical field of the 70s. We won't go into these terms, reflection, symptom, and manifestation, imaginary and resolution, here, except to say that Jameson is synthesizing a lot of the thinking around this kind of idea of the dialectics of subject and object, of essence and appearance, of abstractness and concretion, by bringing in terms that others have used to try to think through this. So symptom is a word that's associated with psychoanalysis in some sense, and with Freud in particular. And the imaginary and the symbolic resolutions here might be a reference to Jacques Lacan's rereading of Freud, which Jameson seems to be suggesting by bringing these terms into the equation here have something to do with the dialectical method that Jameson is interested in. Okay. Let's also talk briefly about this idea down here of ideograms. So, again, with this kind of synthesis that I was talking about with introducing these terms, we're not going to say more about Max Weber here and the points that Jameson is making around Puritanism, except to say that this synthesis of Weber's thought and what Weber sees as one of the causes or contributing factors in the development of capitalism in the West, Puritanism. Jameson is not saying this is wrong, right? Jameson is not saying this is I disagree with Weber's analysis explicitly here, although he may well do. What he wants to say is that there is a way of reading many of these different thinkers' ideas regarding the relationship between superstructure and infrastructure as variations on the same theme. And this is the idea of variations on the same model have far more in common with each other as ideograms. This is Jameson's idea of ideograms, which is kind of structurally similar thoughts that have similar structure. Let's put it that way. I don't have much logic behind the different colors I'm using here. I'm just trying to make clear some of the different terms that are being introduced. So the description for what an ideogram is a form of consciousness which is superimposed against the pattern of collective and institutional organization. And as ideograms, Weber's interpretations have far more in common with other works such as the Theology of Reformers or Changes in the Structure of 16th Century Commerce. So what Jameson is interested in about this thought of someone like Weber is the will to link together in a single figure two incommensurable realities, right? Remember at the top when Jameson was talking about Adorno, he says Adorno's thought seems to be interested in articulating or in sort of putting forward exactly what it wants to resist. That's a paraphrase of what Jameson was saying, but there are two incommensurable realities at work, and the question is, how do we hold these two in tension? And here, this ground that we've covered has been to introduce this kind of reading of Adorno's work, of Adorno's critique of culture, and now it seems we're going to turn to Adorno's text itself and show, presumably, what Jameson has just outlined he thinks exists within Adorno's work. So with that, let's go back to reading and hopefully get to the end of this section here before turning back to close reading. So let's start from up here again to make sure we have the right context. Let the following passage from Adorno's philosophy of the new music stand, therefore, not so much as an implied philosophical proposition or as a novel reinterpretation of the historical phenomena in question, but rather as a metaphorical composition, a kind of stylistic or rhetorical trope through which the new historical and dialectical consciousness, shattering the syntactic conventions of older analytical or static thought, comes to its truth in the language of events. Quote from Adorno: "It is hardly an accident that mathematical techniques in music, as well as logical positivism, originated in Vienna. The fondness for number games is as peculiar to the Viennese mind as the game of chess in the coffee house. There are social reasons for it. All the while, intellectually productive forces in Austria were rising to the technical level characteristic of high capitalism. Material forces lagged behind. The resultant, unused capacity for figures became the symbolic fulfillment of the Viennese intellectual. If he wanted to take part in the actual process of material production, he had to look for a position in Imperial Germany. If he stayed home, he became a doctor or lawyer, or clung to number games as a mirage of financial power. Such is the way the Viennese intellectual tries to prove something to himself, and, bitteschön, to everyone else as well." End quote. Psychoanalysis of the Austrian character, object lesson in the way society revolves in the imaginary realm, those contradictions which it cannot overcome in the real, stylistic juxtaposition of music, symbolic logic, and financial sheets. The text under consideration is all of these things, but it is first and foremost a complete thing. I am tempted to say a poetic object. For its most characteristic connectiveness, quote, "it is no accident that," end quote, are less signs of some syllogistic operation to perform than they are equivalents of the, quote, "just as so," of the heroic simile. Nor does the sudden exchange of energy involved really tell us anything new about either of the elements juxtaposed. Indeed, we must already know what each of them is, in its own specificity, to appreciate their unexpected connection with each other. What happens is rather that, for a fleeting instant, we catch the glimpse of a unified world, of a universe in which discontinuous realities are nonetheless somehow implicated with each other and intertwined, no matter how remote they may at first have seemed, in which the reign of chance briefly refocuses into a network of cross-relationships wherever the eye can reach, contingency temporarily transmuted into necessity. It is not too much to say that through such a historical form, there is momentarily effected a kind of reconciliation between the realm of matter and that of spirit. For in its framework, the essentially abstract character of the ideological phenomenon suddenly touches earth, takes on something of the density and significance of an act in the real world of things and material production, while there flashes across the material dimension itself a kind of transfiguration, and what had only an instant before seemed inertia and the resistance of matter, the sheer meaninglessness of historical accident, and the determining factors of Austrian development, the chance agents of geography or foreign influence, now finds itself unexpectedly spiritualized by the ideality of the objects with which it has been associated, reorganizing itself under the pull of those mathematical systems which are its end product, into a constellation of unforeseen uniformities, into a socio-economic style which can be named. Thus the mind incarnates itself in order to know reality, and in return finds itself in a place of heightened intelligibility. It is, however, one of the most basic lessons of dialectical method that the potentialities for development of a given mode of thought lie predetermined and, as it were, foreordained within the very structure of the initial terms themselves, and reflect the characteristics of its point of departure. The limits on any large-scale projection of the sociological figure here described are therefore implicit in the nature of the objects synthesized. Like wit, the Adorno trope drew its force from the instantaneity of the perception involved, and it is only too clear that to juxtapose against its historical background a cultural item understood in an isolated, atomistic way, whether it be an individual work, a new technique or theory, even something as vast as a new movement understood as a separate entity or a period style detached from its historical continuum, is to ensure the construction of a model that cannot but be static. Okay, let's go to the footnote here, which is a footnote on the Adorno trope drew its force from the instantaneity of the perception involved. So down here to footnote 2. This should not, however, be taken as evidence for the presence of two alternating and imperfectly assimilated modes of dialectical thought in Adorno's own work. There, on the contrary, an almost physical cause may be said to account for the structural peculiarity of the text in question, which is neither more nor less than a complete footnote. And the abundance, as well as the stylistic and philosophical quality of the footnotes to Philosophie der Neuen Musik, is itself no accident and has symptomatic value. The footnote in this context may indeed be thought of as a small but autonomous form, with its inner laws and conventions, and its own determinate relationship to the larger form which governs it, something on the order of the moral of a fable, or the various types of digressions which flourished within the 19th century novel. In the present instance, the footnote as a lyrical form allows Adorno a momentary release from the inexorable logic of the material under the study of the main text, permitting him to shift to other dimensions, to the infrastructure as well as to the wider horizons of historical speculation. The very limits of the footnote, it must be short, it must be complete, allow the release of intellectual energies, in that they serve as a check on a speculative tendency that might otherwise run wild, on what we will later describe as the proliferation of, quote, theories of history, end quote. The footnote as such, therefore, designates a moment in which systematic philosophizing and the empirical study of concrete phenomena are both false in themselves, in which living thought, squeezed out from between them, pursues its fitful existence in the small print at the bottom of the page. Okay, going on with this paragraph here that begins just above the footnote. Thus, the full-scale study of superstructures, the construction of the historical trope, not to lyrical but rather to extended and epic proportions, presupposes a transcendence of the atomistic nature of the cultural term. It is essentially the difference between the juxtaposition of an individual novel against its socio-economic background and the history of the novel seen against the same background. In effect, at this point, a relationship which was that of form to background, of point to field, gives place to the superposition of two fields, two series, two continua. The language of causality gives way to that of analogy or homology, of parallelism. Now the construction of the microcosm, of the cultural continuum, whether it be the formal history of costume or of religious movements, the fate of stylistic conventions, or the rise and fall of epistemology as a philosophical issue, will include the analogy with the socio-economic macrocosm or infrastructure as an implied comparison in its very structure, permitting us to transfer the terminology of the latter to the former in ways that are often very revealing. Thus, it turns out that as a marketable commodity on the spiritual level, the 19th century novel may also be said to have known its version of a stage of, quote, primitive accumulation of capital. The names of Scott and Balzac may be associated with this initial stockpiling of social and anecdotal raw material for processing and ultimate transformation into marketable, that is to say, narratable, shapes and forms. At the same time, inasmuch as the cultural is far less complex than the economic, it may serve as a useful introduction to the real on a reduced, simplified scale. Thus Engels spoke of Balzac's, quote, complete history of French society, from which, even in economic details, for instance, the rearrangement of real and personal property after the Revolution, I have learned more than from all the professed historians, economists, and statisticians of the period together, end quote. Traditionally, indeed, Marxist literary criticism has furnished a convenient introduction both to subtleties of the dialectical method and to the complexities of Marxist social and economic doctrine. But what Engels learned from the content, a modern Marxist literary criticism ought to be able to demonstrate at work within the form itself. So, it is the model that now helps us to read the bewildering and massive substance of the real, of which it began by being the projection. Okay. End of section. Okay, so we started here with this quote, which is a quote from Adorno's Philosophy of the New Music. And let's zoom out a bit here. Okay, so I'm just going to draw a line there to move to this kind of section that is putatively the whole chapter is about Adorno. But as you can see, we're getting a lot of synthesis of other thinkers, of other ideas in this attempt to kind of talk through Adorno. And to be fair to Jameson, this is what he said he would do in the introduction. He said, I'm not trying to do a journalistic summary of Adorno's thought. I'm trying to introduce the kind of difficult character of dialectical thought through these thinkers in some sort of way. But we do get here a long quote from Adorno, which is about the mathematical techniques and music as well as logical positivism that originated in Vienna. And the gist of this quote here, for Jameson's purposes, seems to be several things. I mean, he says here, the set of questions here basically indicate, I think, that Jameson thinks this is a somewhat enigmatic framing, and it's not immediately obvious how one should interpret this kind of statement of Adorno's, that mathematical techniques didn't originate in Vienna by accident, but that there was something about Austria in that time that formed these particular kinds of modes of thinking and made it maybe not necessary, but at least made it sensible that they emerged within that context. So Jameson says the text under consideration is all of these things that he's mentioned in question, but first and foremost, it is a complete thing. I am tempted to say a poetic object. So we haven't heard this term poetic object before, but in our thinking around the base and the superstructure, we saw that for Jameson there was this idea that literature is a sort of privileged object in some sense of thinking the base and the superstructure, or of dialectical thinking writ large. So when he says that Adorno's text is a poetic object, we're thinking maybe this is related to what Jameson sees as literature's relationship to dialectical thinking. So for its most characteristic connectives, it is no accident that, unless signs of some syllogistic operation to perform, then they are equivalents of the just as so of the heroic simile. So this is quite a difficult statement for me. I think the heroic simile I understand to mean this tendency in the work of Virgil and Homer in particular to describe the thought process of a particular hero or a set of actions of a particular hero through a very extended simile, right? Just as Aeneas was doing this particular thing at this time, he was doing it just as if he was a sheep or a wolf in the fields searching after some sheep or something along those lines, right? So Jameson says Adorno's emphasizing that mathematical techniques originated in Vienna is less signs of some syllogistic operation than they are equivalents of heroic simile. So it's more, the suggestion here seems to be that it is more something that helps. Adorno is suggesting this in a way to help us understand why mathematic techniques originated in Vienna, in the same way that a heroic simile helps us to understand or give new character to the sort of action that a hero is taking. I think let's leave it at that for now. So what happens in Adorno's statement, Jameson suggests, is that we catch a glimpse of a unified world, of a universe in which discontinuous realities are nonetheless somehow implicated with each other and intertwined, in which the reign of chance briefly refocuses into a network of cross-relationships wherever the eye can reach, contingency temporarily transmuted into necessity. Okay, so the suggestion here seems to be that Adorno's statement about mathematical techniques emerging in Vienna is a proposal of a sort of synthesis that emerges in our cognizing and our understanding of it, where without a broader system to understand all of these historical events, all of these things that happened, everything is just contingent, right? Everything just happens randomly or without sort of noticeable cause, without noticeable connection to anything else. There can be no notion of understanding in a sort of causal historical sense, because everything is just chaotic and everything is contingent. What Adorno's comments do for Jameson is they temporarily transmute contingency into necessity. They temporarily give us a frame through which we can understand events in the world, in this case, events in Vienna. It is not too much to say, Jameson says, that through such a historical form, so I think it's a historical form because this is the making of history, right? The turning contingency into necessity, the giving some sort of sensible progression to facts or to happenings is the making of history, right? This is what we call history. There is momentarily effected a kind of reconciliation between the realm of matter and that of spirit. For in this framework of this temporary moment, the essentially abstract character of the ideological phenomenon, and there's probably a reason that Jameson is interested in this discussion of mathematics, right? Because mathematics seems this very abstract phenomenon. And, sorry, I just accidentally jumped back to the beginning. Let me bring myself back up to speed. Adorno here is interested in mathematics, music, and logical positivism, right, which are forms of thinking. They seem like abstract things that don't have a clear connection maybe to the material world. And the straightforward suggestion here of Adorno is obviously that there is some sort of situation in Austria that produces these sort of intellectual tendencies or these sort of intellectual traditions. So in that moment of kind of saying these abstract things are produced by something else, a history, the beginnings of a history are made because some sense is given to a progression of events, and the sense that is given to this progression of events, coming back to this idea of the heroic simile, is poetically formed in some sort of sense, right? It is to say, we understand this as if by this. It's not an arbitrary connection in the sense that heroic similes, you don't say, this hero did this and then just choose a random instance in order to help describe, or a random new description to help describe what it is you're trying to describe. You choose the simile because it has a particular character that allows you to see something in the original event that you couldn't see without that simile. And Jameson is suggesting that Adorno is doing the same thing here with the production of mathematics and logical positivism in Vienna. And there is thus a momentary reconciliation between the realm of matter and that of spirit. So again, we're getting back to these sort of fundamental tensions here. The superstructure and the infrastructure. It wouldn't be wrong, I don't think, to associate those two terms on either side of that kind of diagram. So these two things are momentary synthesized. The ideological phenomena suddenly touches earth. The sheer meaningless of historical accident, the inertia and the resistance of matter, so these events that didn't have sense before, now find themselves unexpectedly spiritualized because they exist now not as crude moments of matter that have no relationship to other matter, but they have relationships to other moments of matter in thought. And so there is the spiritualization of the objects by the ideality of the objects with which it has been associated. Ideality meaning there the thinkability, the fact that the object is brought into thought. Reorganizing itself into a constellation of unforeseen uniformities, into a socio-economic style which can be named, right? So it is given body in language. This is the historical moment, or the historical form that is being brought in Adorno's analysis of culture, and this more generally, but this particular analysis of mathematics, how mathematics emerged in Vienna, or certain forms of mathematical thinking came out of Vienna, is another instance, or is a particular instance in that broader diagram. So maybe let's just plot it out very briefly here. So we have the culture industry in general, right, which is Adorno's project of dialectically critiquing the culture industry, and Jameson has chosen this particular moment of mathematics and logical positivism that emerge in Vienna as a sort of example of this broader culture industry. And Adorno's critique of this culture industry writ large, and of mathematics and logical positivism in Vienna in particular, produce, Jameson says, a historical form, a temporary synthesis of matter and spirit. Right, whereby the matter is seemingly spiritualized because it is given this network and relationship to language. And all of this constitutes, Adorno says, thus the mind incarnates itself in order to know reality, and in return finds itself in a place of heightened intelligibility. So the reason for this temporary synthesis, the necessity of this temporary synthesis, is that in order to achieve this abstract kind of idea of intelligibility of the world, one must go through this movement, this dialectical movement from matter to spirit, right? Otherwise, you're not understanding the world. You might just be understanding arbitrary dances of ideas or something along those lines. So this process of dialectical critique that Adorno is doing, I think it's important to note, is again fundamentally embroiled in the finding terms for that matter, right? In naming the things. And this intelligibility is the mind incarnating itself. There is both, again, that kind of temporary synthesis of matter and spirit in this phrasing, that thus the mind incarnates itself. Okay, so here I don't want to go into that paragraph too much, but I do think it's interesting just to note quickly the sort of function of this footnote within the text, because interestingly, this footnote seems to be a sort of meta-commentary on footnotes in general in Jameson, right? He comes to this conclusion. The footnote as such, therefore, designates a moment in which systematic philosophizing and the empirical study of concrete phenomena are both false in themselves. So in this footnote, quite sort of meta-poetically, Jameson is using this footnote to talk about the importance of footnotes for this dialectical method of language that he sees in Adorno, but that he is also cultivating himself. He sees this digression, the various types of digression which flourished within the 19th century novel, as an important kind of departure from, or momentary release, he says here, from the inexorable logic of the material, under study in the main text, permitting him to shift to other dimensions. So within a text itself has a focus, right, and a subject that it must discuss. But these footnotes and these digressions are important to allow momentary releases from the actual content matter of the text, and to introduce kind of new arguments or new perspectives, new kind of ways of thinking about what is being argued or what is being discussed. And one way to understand this might be to liken what Jameson is saying about the footnote here to what I don't actually have a representation of it here, but what we were saying about this heroic simile. Is that the heroic simile introduces a new context into the sort of framework of the plot, right? Instead of talking about Aeneas, we're suddenly talking about wolves, or we're suddenly talking about ghosts, or we're suddenly talking about something else. But this momentary release is actually important as part of the movement of understanding, of releasing us from the inexorable logic of the material. So there's a interesting ambivalence in this word material, obviously, right? Where material here, in the context of this footnote that we're just briefly discussing, footnote. Material here means the material of the argument, of the text, right? The main topic, the main substance. It doesn't mean something physically out there in the world necessarily. But in the context of this line of thought, the argumentation of the text, this main topic is the material. And we need a sort of momentary release from it in order to understand it better. So the point I want to bring up here is that the material it's impossible to think of materiality as referring only to sort of physical things in the world, right? Because when I say I have this bottle here, this is a physical thing. But as soon as I call it a bottle, as soon as I understand it in any way, it becomes spiritualized in this particular sort of sense, where now I think of it as an instance of all possible bottles in some sort of way. So the way in which I encounter materiality is always through language. And the process of understanding, of constructing intelligibility, of incarnating the mind, is this movement of forming things as materiality, as givens, as objects, releasing from them through a footnote, through poetic metaphor, through something else, and coming back to the material in some sort of way. There is this movement of thought that Jameson seems to be cultivating, and the footnote seems to be supporting that in some sense. So on this next page, I think he's doing something similar, or arguing with the same idea of movement in mind, where he says, right, at this moment, he's interested in this moment of kind of release, of re-perspectivizing matter. In effect, at this point, a relationship which was that of form to background, there was this thing and there was a background, suddenly, or gives place to the superposition of two fields, two series, two continua. The language of causality gives way to that of analogy or homology. So here we might have a real kind of set of terms to grasp what Jameson was trying to say with this idea of heroic simile, where in this movement of thought, this dialectical movement of thought, causality, this idea that one thing happens after the other, this thing caused this thing to happen, caused this thing to happen, gives way to analogy or homology. So causality here has a kind of hierarchical relationship, right? Where, I could probably diagram that a bit better, where thing one goes to thing two. Let's draw it actually vertically so that the hierarchy is kind of clearer. Thing one goes to thing two, goes to thing three. There is a hierarchical understanding of how one thing relates to the other. In analogy or homology, there's more of a sliding kind of horizontal relationship between these things, where we have thing one, we have thing two, we have thing three, and analogy says this is kind of like this thing, right? Or it's as if this is this thing. Or this thing is similar to this thing, right? It is a relationship, it is establishing meaning and a network between these kind of atomistic moments of reality, but it is not as rigid a network as causality. And both the heroic simile and the footnote, I would suggest, are doing this kind of shift for Jameson. They are moving an understanding of moments of materiality as causally related to each other to this temporary relief in analogy or homology, where there is this kind of flash of it might not actually be the case that this happens, that this causes this, and that this then causes this. There is a new possibility of ways to think things here, where it doesn't have to be that 1 goes to 2 goes to 3, but maybe there is even a relationship between 1 and 3 in this kind of flash or shift. So this moment of analogy or homology is very important, it seems, for Jameson in the construction of dialectical thinking. Okay. There is this reference here to marketable commodity on the spiritual level, and I don't think I'm going to go into this today exactly, because I want to make sure we get through the text, but something that we haven't yet talked about in depth, so I'm just going to not footnote it, but put the word here so that we can return to it later, is Marx as a thinker of the dialectical process. We could call these Marxian dialectics. And these terms, just as we were talking about how the idea of a symptom recalls Freud and the idea of a symbolic, imaginary, real triad recalls Lacan, the commodity and the marketability, this quotation, primitive accumulation of capital, isn't actually attributed to anyone, but the assumption would be that because Jameson is expecting his reader to be familiar with Marxist critique generally, the reader would know or assume that this is a reference to Marx's idea of primitive accumulation of capital. So just as we suggested that there seemed to be a commitment, a certain kind of commitment or inkling that Jameson has to psychoanalytic dialectics, in the reference of these terms from Freud and Lacan, there also seems to be the suggestion that he has some investment in Marxian dialectics, and we're just going to leave it at that for now. Engels, another figure very associated with Marx because he was his patron and they published texts together and that sort of thing. So it makes sense and is interesting that Jameson goes from talking about this kind of referring to this idea of Marxian dialectics and then shifting to a quotation from Engels, who basically says in this quotation, as we read, that he's learned a lot more from looking at from the complete history of French society, this idea of sort of like atomistic happenings of French society, than he has learned from all the historians, economists, and statisticians of this period. Which is to say, Engels seems to be saying he's learned a lot more from the infrastructure than he has from any sort of superstructural synthesis of it. And indeed, Jameson says, traditionally Marxist literary criticism has furnished a convenient introduction both to the subtleties of dialectic method and to the complexities of Marxist social economic doctrine. So traditionally Marxist literary criticism has insisted on this kind of attachment to the materiality, to the infrastructure, or to the base. And Jameson in some sense seems to be wanting to push against that grain and say, but what Engels learned from the content, a modern Marxist literary criticism ought to be able to demonstrate a work within the form itself. So another dyad that we should add to this list of dyads that we have here is form, make sure I get this the right way around, content and form, right? So while traditional Marxist literary criticism has kind of tended to emphasize this content, as the Engels quote suggests, Jameson says, I want to push against that grain a little bit and focus on the form to some extent. So it is the model that now helps us to read the bewildering and massive substance of the real. Okay, so here is just another sort of poetic, but also one could really dig into the details of what Jameson is talking about here when he talks about the bewildering and massive substance of the real as the project of understanding the world at large. And this project of understanding the world at large, again, to risk, beating a dead horse, is embroiled with language, which is what this intricate framing at the level of the sentence in Jameson's work seems to be suggesting. And I think it's interesting to also just say here, in relationship to these two terms, the kind of Marxian dialectics and psychoanalytic dialectics, that this phrase, bewildering a massive substance of the real, let's just write that down, bewildering and massive substance of the real, in a really interesting way splits the difference between psychoanalytic dialectics and Marxian dialectics. So substance is a term that many psychoanalytic thinkers would have some uncomfortability with because of Freud's insistence on the unconscious, and I don't think I want to get too deeply into the details here, but for me, the substance term is much more associated with a sort of Marxian dialectics, because Marx talks about the substance of value in Capital, where he talks about labor as the substance of value. Whereas this other term, the real, is more associated with this psychoanalytic dialectics because, if only because of Lacan's symbolic, imaginary, real triad that we briefly discussed before. So in this, even at the level of the sentence, as Jameson promised he would do, he is asking us to reconsider the context of these terms. He's trying to throw these terms into relief in a certain sense, because to say there is a substance of the real is, as I said, in some sense to go against a psychoanalytic dialectical framing. There may be some, I'm not saying that all psychoanalytic thinkers would resist the idea of a substance of the real, but it introduces some difficulties, I think we could at least say. But when we think about this from the other perspective, from the perspective of Marxian dialectics, to say there is a substance of the real could be put into context with how labor is the substance of value. So, which is to say, what in the real, what in reality, what is the kind of missing cause that is in the system of reality as we understand it? This is one way of thinking about why labor is the substance of value for Marx, is because labor is this kind of contradictory term within the logic of capital. The logic of capital both needs labor but also wants to diminish it. And therefore, to think about the substance of the real here is to ask the question of what is the sort of contradictory essence of the way that we understand the world. So even at the level of the sentence here, and this is not even to get into this final clause of which it began by being the projection, even at the level of the sentence, Jameson is doing this intricate work of trying to get us to think dialectically. Okay. So we're going to move on to the next section, and I didn't say at the top of the stream, but I'll probably go for another hour or so. So hopefully we'll be able to get through at least some of this next section. Let's see how long it is. Okay, let's try to get through all of this next section, and then we'll pick up, obviously, with the remainder of this section in the next stream. So starting from 1 here. The ideal material for a full-scale demonstration of such historical models would no doubt be drawn from spheres as distant from everyday life as possible. Non-Euclidean geometry, for example, or the various logical worlds of science fiction, in which our own universe is reduplicated at an experimental level. Illustrations derived from the history of the visual arts or from the development of mathematics are thus more useful for our purposes than the more representational modes of literature or philosophy. For in dialectical treatments of the latter, there tends to take place a kind of slippage from form into content which cannot but blur the methodological points to be made. Thus, our characterization of Balzac's primitive accumulation of raw material above, okay, so I was wrong, above this was actually a reference to Balzac's primitive accumulation, was intended to function on a formal level, to underscore a parallel between two formal processes. Yet the analogy is complicated by the fact that Balzac's raw material, his content, happens to be precisely that primitive accumulation of capital with which we compared the form. For the origins of the first businesses and the first fortunes are among the archetypal stories he has to tell. As a model, therefore, literature is not so useful as the more abstract arts, and the parallels with developments in the novel will, in what follows, be underlined as analogies to the central model to be presented, rather than as historical projections in their own right. Yet even the specialized is sometimes taken for granted. Even highly sophisticated techniques can come to seem natural in the general indistinction of everyday life. So it turns out that to assess the full originality of Adorno's historical vision, we must try to bring a new unfamiliarity to some of the social phenomena we are accustomed to take for granted. To stare, for instance, with the eyes of a foreigner at the row upon row of people in formal clothing, seated without stirring within their armchairs, each seemingly without contact with his neighbors, yet at the same time strangely divorced from any immediate visual spectacle. The eyes occasionally closed, as in powerful concentration, occasionally scanning with idle distraction the distant cornices of the hall itself. For such a spectator, it is not at once clear that there is any meaningful relationship between this peculiar behavior and the bewildering tissue of instrumental noises that seems to provide a kind of background for it, like Arab musicians playing behind the curtain. Their curtain. What is taken for granted by us is not apparent to such an outsider, namely that the event around which the concert hall is itself established consists precisely of attention to that stream of sound patterns entering in at the ear, to the organized and meaningful succession of a non-verbal sign system as to a kind of purely instrumental speech. For Western polyphonic music is, quote, unnatural precisely to the degree to which it has no institutional equivalent in any other culture. Though it has its origins in ritual, though its earliest forms are not essentially distinct from the dance and chant, the pure monody of other cultures, Western music, in its most characteristic forms, has severed its ties with those primitive musical activities in which the musical substance, still involved in concrete life and social reality, may be said to have remained representational, to have preserved something like a content. There is no longer a mere difference in degree, but rather an absolute one in kind between the older functional music and this, which has developed an autonomy of its own, has acquired the status of an event in its own right, and requires its participants to suspend their other activities in the exercise of some alert but non-verbal mental capacity which had never been used before, with the conviction that something real is taking place during 15 or 20 minutes of practical immobility. It is as if a new sense had been invented, for the active interpretive concentration which marks such listening is as distinct from ordinary hearing as is mathematical language from ordinary speech. As if a new organ had been developed, a new type of perception formed. What is particularly noteworthy is the poverty of the materials from which such new perception had been fashioned. For the ear is the most archaic of the senses, and instrumental sounds are far more abstract and inexpressive than words or visual symbols. Yet, in one of those paradoxical reversals that characterize the dialectical process, it is precisely this primitive, regressive starting point that determines the development of the most complex of arts. Finally, we must observe that inasmuch as Western music is not natural but historical, inasmuch as its development depends so intensely upon the history and development of our own culture, it is mortal as well, and has it in it to die as a genuine activity, to vanish when it has served its purpose, and when that social need which it once answered has ceased to exist. The fact that the production of so-called classical records has become a big business in the present day should not make us lose sight of the privileged relationship between the golden age of Western music and a central Europe in which a significant portion of the collectively performed music in which a significant proportion of the collectivity performed music and knew it from the inside, in a qualitatively different fashion from the passive consumers of our own time. In much the same way, such a genre as the epistolary novel loses its very reason for being and its social as well as linguistic basis in a period when letter writing is no longer an important everyday activity and an institutionalized form of communication. So also certain types of lyric poetry will vanish from cultures in which conversation and verbal expressions are colorless and without life, lacking in any capacity for those twin forms of expansion which are eloquence or figuration. So it is that Western music at the very outset marks itself off from culture as a whole, reconstitutes itself as a self-contained and autonomous sphere at a distance from the everyday of social life, from the social life of the period, and developing, as it were, parallel to it. Not only does music thereby acquire an internal history of its own, but it also begins to duplicate on a smaller scale all the structures and levels of the social and economic macrocosm itself, and displays its own internal dialectic, its own producers and consumers, its own infrastructure. In it, For instance, as in the larger world of business and industry, we find a tiny history of inventions and machines, what might be called the engineering dimension of musical history, that of the instruments themselves, which stand in the same ambiguous relationship of cause and effect to the development of works and forms as do their technological equivalents, the steam engine. They arrive on the scene with a kind of symbolic fitness. It is not, quote, "It is not for nothing that the newly soulful tone of the violin counts among the great innovations of the age of Descartes," end quote. This is from Adorno's text. Throughout its long ascendancy, indeed, the violin preserves this close identification with the emergence of individual subjectivity on the stage of philosophical thought. It remains a privileged medium for the expression of the emotions and demands of the lyrical subject, and the violin concerto, much like the Bildungsroman, stands as the vehicle for individual lyric heroics, while in other forms the massed orchestral strings conventionally represent the welling up of subjective feeling and of protest against the necessities of the objective universe. By the same token, when composers begin to suppress the singing violin tone and to orchestrate without strings, or to transform the stringed instrument into a plucked, almost percussive device, as in the ugly pizzicati, the strummings and weird falsetto effects of Schoenberg, what happens to the violin is to be taken as a sign of the determination to express what crushes the individual, to pass from the sentimentalization of individual distress to a new post-individualistic framework. In a similar way, the rise of the saxophone, in that commercial music which replaces the older folk art of the masses, has symbolic value. For with it vibration, the oscillation back and forth in place, supersedes the soaring of the violin as an embodiment of subjective experience in the modern age, and a metallic sound, all pipes and valves, yet sexually ambivalent to the degree to which it, quote, mediates between brass and woodwinds, end quote. This is another quote in brackets, being materially related to the former, while it remains woodwind in its mode of performance, end quote, replaces the living warmth of the older instrument, which expressed life where the newer one merely simulates it. And if musical forms evolve in response to their public, church and salon music being little by little supplanted by middle-class spectator forms, so also they are influenced by the changing social functions of their performers as well. Wagner, himself a great conductor, for the first time undertakes to compose music in which the role of the virtuoso conductor is foreseen and built into the structure of the score. As in parliamentary demagoguery, the listening masses submit to the conductor with a kind of hypnotized fascination. The quality of their listening deteriorates. They lose that autonomy of judgment and intensity of concentration which the earlier generations of the triumphant middle class brought to their practice of the art. Thus, they are increasingly unable to follow anything as thoroughly organized as a Beethoven sonata, and instead of the theme and variations with its development and resolution in time, Wagner offers then something cruder and easier to grasp, the repetition of easily recognizable themes, not unlike advertising slogans, fatefully underlined for the listener's benefit by the dictatorial gesture of the conductor. At the same time, the development of the leitmotif must be understood in terms of the autonomous dialectic of the musical tradition itself, as one of the stages in that slow working out of musical laws and of the possibilities inherent in the musical raw material. From this point of view, the Wagnerian theme, with its rigidity and its non-developing character, must be seen as a regression from the themes of Beethoven, which were functionally inseparable from their context. If there is for music something like a, quote, heresy of paraphrase, end quote, in the brutal wrenching of melody or theme from a texture in which alone it has its reason for being, then it must be added that such a practice finds its initial stimulus not so much in the caprice or formal ignorance of the individual listener as in the deeper equivalence or cleavage between form and content in the very structure of the work itself. For Beethoven, the sonata represented a complex solution to the problem of musical identity and musical change. The characteristics of the form, the dispatching of the theme to the most distant and unexpected keys, in order that it may return, this time with a kind of finality, to its point of origin, the thoroughgoing metamorphoses it is made to undergo in variation after variation, in order to demonstrate the more surely its identity with itself, are at one with the very establishment of the tonal system itself, for they amount to a concrete reenactment before the listener of tonality as a self-evident law, reconfirmed through the form. For Wagner, however, the problem is that of setting up a relationship between leitmotifs which cannot be varied in the old sense. For it is now the leitmotif rather than the basic key of the composition which is the element of permanence. To make a virtue of necessity, the expression fixes the very essence of the dialectical process at the same time that it defines Wagner's freedom with respect to the historical situation. In order to devise a constructional principle capable of dealing with the archaic and cumbersome phenomenon of static repetition, Wagner finds himself obliged to invent something which bears in itself the seeds of the most advanced and progressive of future musical techniques. To be sure, the manner in which the sheer vertical sonority of the Wagnerian orchestra edges up or down the half tones separating the various leitmotifs from each other must ultimately complete the destruction of the sonata form and of the tonality on which it is based. Yet at the same time, this new chromaticism points, even beyond atonality, towards the future resystematization of the 12-tone row, and may thus serve as an object lesson in the way in which the historically new is generated out of the contradictions of a particular situation and moment, and as an illustration of the function in dialectical analyses of such terms as progressive and regressive, by means of which elements of a given complex are distinguished only in order to re-identify them the more surely in their separability and to make possible a differential perception of the place of a given moment in the historical continuum. The Wagnerian invention of chromaticism, therefore, as an example of development within an autonomous system, offers a small-scale model of the changes we might expect to find in the macrocosm of socio-economic history itself. So it is, for instance, that the economic backwardness of 19th century Germany was responsible for the failure of the attempts to develop parliamentary government, which issued from the Revolution of 1848, and led that notorious and fateful separation between German nationalism and the more progressive Western-style democratic aspirations of the middle classes. Thus, socio-economic backwardness resulted in political authoritarianism. Yet inasmuch as the latter was able to stimulate industrial development far more effectively than parliamentary regimes elsewhere, the initial lag ultimately results in a dialectical leap, which leaves Germany abreast of its greatest rival in production by the end of the 19th century, and in possession of the newest industrial plant in Europe. And what obtains in the infrastructure yields an analogy for developments in other arts as well. I choose more or less at random, from the history of the novel, the example of Proust, where an initial predilection for the essay as a mode of discourse combines with an initial predisposition to the long static scene as an existential experience of the present to produce an unexpected organizational innovation. For Proust expands his formal scene to the point where the essay-style digressions and disquisitions may be intercalated in succession with as little disruption as may be produced by the change of subject or of conversation partner in the course of a long afternoon reception. Meanwhile, the scenes themselves, as immense as they are now reconnected by topic, in much the same static fashion in which the essay pre-selected its subject matter, by means of the hours of the day or the stops on a train, or ultimately indeed by the very geographical identity of the Swan and Guermantes ways themselves. Yet the result of this rather static organization, initially determined by a storytelling deficiency in the Proustian imagination, is a more complex rendering of the passage of time that had hitherto been possible in conventional linear narration. For Adorno, therefore, the names of the artists stand as so many moments in the history of the form, as so many lived unities between situation and invention, between contradiction and that determinate resolution from which new contradictions spring. A whole vision of movement of modern history is built implicitly into the lens through which we watch the progression of music from Beethoven to Schoenberg and Stravinsky. In particular, these two final figures illustrate what is, for Adorno, an exemplary archetypal opposition, standing as the twin symbolic possibilities of the 20th century creation, as the very prototypes, indeed above and beyond art itself, of the alternatives remaining to thought and action in a henceforth totalitarian universe. It is therefore to his influential and seminal study of these two figures under the title of Philosophy of the New Music that we now turn. Okay, so in this section we seem to be really getting some detail on this analysis of Adorno. So let's create a new shelf here. And this corresponds in the text, I think, to... Not entirely. We're still on section 1, so we don't have any actual sectional distinction yet. Oh, but we did... sorry, we started section 1. This was all section 1, so let's mark that as a distinction. So this is all section 1 that we're now talking about. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell too much on everything in this section, because hopefully the ground that we've already covered in terms of the dialectical method is coming to fruition, or is being put to work here in some sense. What Jameson is concerned with here, initially at least, is Adorno's analysis of music, and we have an analysis of the concert hall, of the sort of transition from violin to saxophone, we have commentary on Beethoven's sonata and its historical relevancy or its relationship to musical identity and musical change. And then we have an investigation or a retelling, interpretation of Adorno's analysis of chromaticism within Wagner's work. And this final analysis is briefly compared to Proust by Jameson. Okay, so the overall commentary here, one of the aspects of this overall commentary that Adorno is doing on the concert hall, on the violin, saxophone, on Beethoven's sonata, is to denaturalize music, right? To allow us to see the conventions of the concert hall as culturally constructed in some sense. And in particular, Jameson is interested in the way that the concert hall operates as its own particular kind of language, as its own particular technical vocabulary of realness or of event, right? So Jameson is interested through Adorno in this way in which the event of the concert hall, of a concerto being played at a concert hall, something like that, becomes real and seems to people as a sort of something that is sensible, but also something that is substantially kind of lifeful and real, even though most of the participants are not moving at any, they were just sitting there and listening. So Jameson says this happens, and this is all kind of under the rubric of denaturalizing music, because concert hall music has a specific vocabulary that is compared with mathematical language or mathematical symbols. Right? Just as ordinary hearing is distinct from mathematical language, there is a new type of perception formed within these 15 or 20 minutes of practical immobility. And there's something regressive, even primitive, about this kind of starting point, right? What is particularly noteworthy is the poverty of the materials from which such new perception has been fashioned. For the ear is the most archaic of the senses, and instrumental sounds are far more abstract and inexpressive than words or visual symbols. So the vocabulary of this concert hall is particularly abstract, Jameson wants to say. And it's abstract because we don't have a language, a direct language to kind of say everything that is happening within music, right? And there's an interesting sort of tension here, which is that obviously there is within Western music a notation system that is very sort of well established for what pieces represent, right, with clefs and staves and this sort of thing. And there is a way that one can read music as a sort of text in this kind of way. Jameson doesn't introduce this dimension, but in saying that music, concert hall music, is an abstract thing, and it is one that people experience, he wants to emphasize through sitting in a concert hall and listening, not through, following along on a score or having memorized the score beforehand or something like that. At least in this particular period, this period being the emergence of Western music. Sorry, I think I was going the wrong way there. The emergence of Western polyphonic music, right? It acquires the status of an event in its own right. It has an autonomy on its own because it doesn't have a clear form of representation within the sort of everyday calculus and thinking of general people. So the reason that, or one of the reasons that music is such an interesting event in this kind of question of how we symbolize real life and what the dialectical process means, is because it doesn't have a clear form of representation, right? Its representation as sense is called into question. And what do I mean there when I say representation as sense? Because it's to do with this idea of the air and audio, right? There is a very clear representation in sense at one level, which is that it's just a sound, right? It's a sound, and this sound happens, and most people, notwithstanding those who are excluded from hearing, can hear the sound and can be affected by it. But the question is, how is one supposed to understand that sound, right? There isn't a clear language through which one knows they should be affected by it, because that kind of language, that sort of vocabulary, has to be learned, right? It isn't that I tell you a word, I say this thing, I say cat, there is a cat on the mat, and there is a clear kind of directive of what is going on in that kind of language operation, right? There is a cat on the mat. It should mean this sort of same thing, some would imagine, to everyone. There is no sort of representational ambiguity. There's no question of representation, some would hope. In music, this is clearly not the case, or at least is a case that has different contours, because the vocabulary of polyphonic music is very different. You can't put it into language very easily. So, Jameson says, we observe that inasmuch as Western music is not natural but historical, which is, I would suggest, something Jameson is a starting point of Jameson's analysis, it is mortal. There is this production, there is this cultural phenomenon of Western music that has become a big business and, has interrelations with Western capitalism and this sort of thing. But these interrelations should not make us lose sight of the privileged relationship between the golden age of Western music and a Central Europe in which a significant proportion of the collectivity performed music and knew it from the inside, in a qualitatively different fashion from the passive consumers of our own time. So there is this investment in the golden age of Western music, because it isn't passively consumed. It is a sort of language, in the sense that language is not passively consumed, right? Language is something that we participate in a conversation. This stream is not a very good example of language in its full capacities, because I am just talking at you in some sense. There isn't this participation in the language through which you form your ability to speak back, and that dynamic changes the way that you understand what words are said to you. This is the dynamic of a participatory language, we could call it, that was characteristic of the golden age of polyphonic music. It was an institutionalized form of communication. And Jameson says, so also certain types of lyric poetry vanish from cultures in which conversation and verbal expression are colorless and without life, lacking in any capacity for those twin forms of expansion which are eloquence and figuration. So, in the same way that lyric poetry has kind of lost its luster in a day and age where communication takes a different form because folks don't participate around sort of bardic lyric poetry in the same way that they did in what Jameson would probably call its golden age, we lose the form for the vocabulary for it and the ability to kind of participate within it, to communicate with it in an institutionalized way. And this technical vocabulary, Jameson suggests, allows us to consider the realm of Western music as an autonomous sphere that is at a distance from everyday social life. So because it has a technical vocabulary, like mathematics, like a refined form of physics or something like that, it operates at a distance, in some sense, from everyday social life. It isn't purely understandable, as if anything could be. It needs to be learned, and one needs to participate in it in order to acquire that vocabulary. Music thereby acquires an internal history of its own, but it also begins to duplicate on a smaller scale all the structures and levels of the social and economic macrocosm itself. It displays its own internal dialectic, its own producers and consumers, its own infrastructure. Okay, so music as a technical vocabulary, as this vocabulary at a distance from everyday reality, acquires, Jameson says, an internal dialectic of its own, which allows us to appreciate it as a sort of object, right? Because it has its own contours. And the object that polyphonic music is in this golden age is reflective in some sort of strange way of the economic, political, and social contours of the reality at which it is from which it is at a distance. So Jameson doesn't use this word here, but we could understand this as polyphonic music in its golden age being a symptom of sorts, or being able to be read as a symptom of everyday reality. So now Jameson shifts to this discussion of the violin and its role in polyphonic music. The violin preserves a close identification with the emergence of individual subjectivity. The violin concerto, much like the Bildungsroman, stands as the vehicle for individual lyric heroics, while in other forms the massed orchestral strings conventionally represent the welling up of subjective feeling and protest against the necessities of the objective universe. So this is Jameson giving us a kind of example of how the specific technical vocabulary of music becomes symptomatic. That's not a very helpful line. Becomes symptomatic of the broader everyday reality, right? There is this sense in which the violin having a heyday moving to the saxophone's now apparent heyday is Jameson's kind of example reading of the way in which the technical vocabulary of polyphonic music can be read as a symptom. Okay, I want to introduce this language that Jameson does of the autonomous. So this technical vocabulary is in some sense autonomous. And it's autonomous because it allows this whole domain to kind of form an object, right? The object which is the object in which Adorno is interested. Within this object, within this domain, certain things are naturalized. So, for example, the tonality here comes to seem a self-evident law. And the sonata form is another example of a sort of symptomatic, of reading polyphonic music as symptomatic of its broader social reality, this broader social reality in which it takes place. So chromaticism, just to complete the circle here, chromaticism as well, I think, is all of these kind of three examples are in some ways examples of the way in which one can read music as symptomatic of its times. Okay, and because we're getting on, I think I'm going to stop there and we'll pick up with section 2, starting here on the next stream. And we'll retain all of these, this diagram of close reading, continue to build it up. So until next time, see you then.